Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new self-titled record from Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeroes. These guys are a California indie rock and indie folk band who, in my opinion, have had one of the more shocking falls from grace since their debut full-length album release in 2009. And when I say shocking, I mean sort of more in recent memory. Back in 2009, when they put out their first full-length Up From Below, it was an album that did not necessarily turn a ton of heads upon its initial release, but it had a few nice sleeper hits on it that got people into the band sort of after the fact. Songs like Home. Really fantastic hit off of this LP, a song that is catchy, very joyful, just jubilant instrumentation that is a mix of folk and rock sounds, and the band's really huge instrumental lineup showed with just how gargantuan and monstrous their sound was. It was like listening to some kind of giant folky Arcade Fire, and when I think about that theory or the idea of that in my head, I'm into that. But I don't think Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeroes really carried forward into their later releases to really kind of capitalize on that potential, really reach their full potential actually. Up From Below was far from a perfect album, but listening to the band's next full length here was like watching a director try to put out the sequel to what essentially was a cult film with no budget and half of the original cast. Everything sounded really rickety on this album, from the instrumentation to the performances. There just were not a lot of good takes on this LP, and I would say the songwriting was just not as concise or succinct or just really straightforward and memorable. I just think it's odd that Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeroes would give up their pop appeal so easily, especially considering that their pop appeal was the best thing they had going for them on Up From Below. Because when it came to the worlds of indie folk and indie pop, they certainly weren't trailblazing or creating any new sounds or anything like that. Now, with this new self-titled full-length of theirs, Edward Sharpe's pop appeal is still out to lunch, except this time I feel like the band is emphasizing that indie folk vibe a little bit less, and instead they're going for something that feels way more vintage with some extremely tacked on soul. And previously, Edward Sharpe's music has tipped its hat to the psychedelic 60s, but this time around on this LP we're getting acid-soaked guitar solos, really thumpy Paul McCartney-esque bass lines and drums that have a really kind of hollow, atmospheric thud to them, as if they were being recorded decades upon decades ago. Instead of sounding authentically vintage, I think this self-titled LP sounds more messy and thrown together than here. Case in point, the song In the Lion, quite possibly the worst mixed song you'll hear this year. The horns, the lead vocals, the horribly performed falsetto background vocals, and the drums all just completely out of whack. And some of these problems aren't even specific to this track. Consistently, I would say the worst thing about this album is Ed Sharpe's voice. While his singing was good and pretty tolerable on previous LPs, I would say much of the time on this album when Ed Sharpe isn't really screaming to reach notes that he doesn't really have, he's using this really forced vibrato that gets annoying after a while as I'm listening to this album. Even though Ed Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeroes may have some real passion for the folk rock and the pop and the rock of the 60s on this album, I feel like them trying to recreate it here is the equivalent to just watching a Broadway rendition of the 60s, the musical 60s, versus some bad street performance of it. I would say that this record is essentially indie folk's answer to A Prairie Home Companion, which is incredibly dorky and incredibly hokey show on NPR that dabbles in country, folk music, a little bit of bluegrass as well. But the thing with A Prairie Home Companion is that it's kind of self-aware, tongue-in-cheek a lot of the time, and I don't really feel that vibe from Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeroes. Even though Ed Sharpe can get silly at times on this album, like on the song Let's Get High when he's singing Ain't We All Just Japanese When We're High, I still can't help but feel like this album is a little serious at points like this. I mean, if this song was put out in 1963, At best, today it would be like a novelty song, but now it just sounds ridiculous. Then there's all these references to love, needing someone's love, giving your love, we all have love for one another, again trying to recapture this emotional, philosophical, sort of social sentiment of young people from this era of music that Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeroes are trying to recreate on this record. And this is just one more thing on this album that falls horribly short of sounding like something I can take seriously or really kind of believe in. I have to be completely honest and say that this album, there isn't much about it I can say that I liked. I mean, the production was really bad and, you know, just technically weak. The instrumentation, again, sounded really flat and just bodiless a lot of the time, just for some kind of cheap attempt to recreate some dead sonic palette. Really, there were only flashes on this album that appealed to me, like, oh, this melody here sounds pretty good, or this vocal take sounds okay, or I like this guitar part here. The only emotion that this album really stirred up in me is that it made me want to go listen to Frank Zappa and the Mothers Were Only in It for the Money. I think after listening to this album, maybe I came at least a little close to gaining a quarter of the anger or annoyance that Frank Zappa had for hippies and their social circle when he wrote this LP. I'm essentially feeling a light to decent 3 on this thing. If you've given it a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. This review is my opinion. If you don't like it, here's a straw. I want to give a shout out to you. You're the best. Only the strong subscribe. All mistakes were intentional. Anthony Fantano, Ed Sharpe, forever.